Good morning, everyone. It is October 1st. Going to talk about Ukraine a little bit, specifically Ukraine's NATO application to start things off. It's a fast track application, but we all need to kind of be realistic about what's going on with this application. It was largely symbolic. Now, he submitted an actual real application, so the process will take place. But we all need to take a step back and realize Ukraine's not going to be joining NATO anytime soon. What this really was a strike back at Putin. When Putin recognized the referenda that were a complete sham in Ukrainian territory, Zelensky found a geopolitical way to strike back at Putin, and that is hit back at one of Putin's biggest, not only fears, but also biggest points of anger, and that is the potential ascension of Ukraine into NATO. Now, like I said, I don't think Ukraine's joining NATO anytime soon, but what Zelensky's now doing is intertwining NATO and Ukraine together, where Putin needs to understand that Ukraine and NATO will respond if Russia continues to escalate the conflict, including increasing nuclear threats. Zelensky mentioned the case of Finland and Sweden ascending very quickly. They use the open door policy, which is the policy that a country can apply to join NATO when it feels like. It took Finland and Sweden decades, and eventually they decided to apply, and now they're being admitted to NATO sometime in the near future. Ukraine's using that same situation. However, supporting the application of Ukraine and actually voting and admitting them into the alliance are two very different things. I just don't think there's a whole lot of support of admitting Ukraine into the alliance while they're in a conflict with Russia. And that's interesting because if you kind of start off with the premise that one of the biggest criteria for joining NATO is the ability to defeat the Russians on the battlefield, then there's no one better right now than Ukraine. The Ukrainian military is essentially teaching NATO how to best defeat the Russians conventionally in the information space. And now the reality is Ukraine is doing this with the help and intensive planning and the equipment to include weapons support from NATO countries. But when you think about it, this only really reinforces Zelensky's point that Ukraine is proving that it has compatibility with NATO standards, meaning they can use NATO equipment, they can learn it very quickly, they can get on board, and they can integrate. And he's right. But while we all consider this, these things are just not going to change the calculus on them joining while they're fighting Russia. And I would argue that their current status to join NATO is not any better than it was before the war started. The main issue is there's no precedent for NATO accepting a new member that is under an occupation from what is objectively NATO's enemy. The biggest concern is what do we do with Article 5, or the collective defense clause of NATO's treaty. It would require all members to come to Ukraine's aid. Now, yes, the Article 5 of the treaty is not automatic and needs to be unanimously agreed upon by NATO members, but those members that would disagree would likely just oppose Ukraine joining NATO right now anyway. So it's all kind of moot, which is why I just don't think this is going to go anywhere. In the meantime, security assurances can be given to Ukraine. I don't know if they're necessarily going to be as strong as the ones we've given Sweden or Finland, which is kind of beyond what currently the US, NATO, and other Ukrainian allies are providing. But that's about the only thing that can assure Ukraine, because they're just not going to join NATO. There's too many questions on what do we do with Article 5, what do we do with Russia. The biggest thing Ukraine needs to do is just keep winning and keep the pressure up on Russia. Those two factors will lead to NATO ascension faster than anything else they can do. Zelensky has painted Ukraine not only as the victim of this war, but also the stronger military, the more competent military. And because of this, most of the allies in NATO have gone further than anyone would have expected in providing support to Ukraine. I think that same path that Zelensky is on, where he is on a path to successfully counter Russia is also the same path that he can use. He can basically make a photocopy of that, and that's the application to join NATO. And yes, they eventually will join, but they won't do it while Russia's occupying them. So we'll see what the future holds. Now, moving on, I'm going to talk a bit about the mobilization because it's gotten pretty out of control. Following the farcical annexations of the 4 regions, interestingly, Ukrainian troops were seen taking pictures in Lyman, meaning that Lyman likely has fallen. An American volunteer currently fighting in Lyman said it's like hunting squirrels in a pecan orchard. Although Ukrainian troops are still fighting and they're not exactly waltzing into town, there's very much a victorious mood there. A lot of it is because conscripts are what's trying to defend the city at this point. Interestingly, because Lyman falls into Russian territory now, or at least Russian claimed territory, according to the Kremlin, technically this would be the first Russian town lost in battle in 81 years. And Ukraine shows no sign in stopping their counteroffensive push. So it's likely we're going to see more quote-unquote Russian annexed towns. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov says that they're not sure how to recognize the borders of these areas. He said he's going to clarify, said that the federal districts being incorporated into Russia, it remains unclear how to do this. There really wasn't any administrative instructions on how to exercise the outcomes of this sham referenda. It was really just a sham in practice, just to show the world Russia can do these types of things. I mean, Ukraine occupies significant portions of 2 of the oblasts and small portions of the other 2. I mean, Putin likely rushed this annexation without making any basic administrative decisions here. So organizing the governance of these is going to be incredibly difficult considering the Ukrainians are gone there. The ones that actually governed the regions previously have left. There's no Ukrainian support, so they're trying to, like baptism by fire, drink from the fire hose, so to speak, on how to run these areas with no help. So we'll see how that goes. Now, Putin announced the usual fall conscription cycle that will start in November. It's about a month late, but that's because it's probably politically dangerous to try to announce the standard conscription right after you just did a normal or a emergency conscription of 300. Let's be real, it's probably more than that. 300,000 troops. So the issue is the optics of this, and they're bad for Putin. Putin signed a decree in response on September 30th that simplifies Russian citizenship processes for foreigners to serve in the military of Russia. They're trying to incentivize foreigners to volunteer and fight. I don't know who would want to be a Russian citizen. That's not really a benefit at this point. Duma deputies from various republics submitted a draft bill to the Russian State Duma on September 30th that would legalize the Russian military recruitment efforts in prisons for the, quote, special military operation, in which the Russians would take 10 days off of a prisoner's sentence for every day they served in Ukraine. So that's how the mobilization's going. I mean, Russian officials are accepting bribes and engaging in other preferential treatment to prevent or ease the burden of mobilization on the wealthy. It's completely a corrupt system, and as would be expected for Russia. I mean, the Ukrainian General Staff reported that there's one oblast that is charging Russian citizens 100,000 rubles for mobilizing individuals to avoid mobilization. But that's an amount largely unattainable for the residents of that oblast. For those of you that are wondering, 100,000 rubles is $1,600. And like I said, the majority of the Russians in this oblast cannot afford it. So corruption is just still flowing through these conscription measures. They're trying to find ways to get inmates out there. And the reports are coming from multiple Russian telegram channels, including the Russian state media, that some of these troops are getting between 0 to 1 days worth of training before they're sent to the front line. There's actually tank crews that only got 3 days of training that were getting into accidents as they were trying to drive their tanks, where 2 Russian tanks ran into each other as they were retreating. So the shit show continues across the board for for Russia, regardless of whatever annexation claims they make. So we'll continue to watch out and see what happens. I think after Lyman, they'll look at Rubizny, but we'll see going forward.